The Climb, a short story by Caleb Wetzel. Narrated by Caleb Wetzel. Digital print version available at calebwetzel.wordpress.com. Jesse clings to the side of the mountain. Cleated, fur-lined boots press into the ice for leverage, while his hands hold rocks jutting out of the otherwise unusually smooth stone surface. A fur coat is wrapped tight around his torso, and the hood is up, trying to keep him somewhat warm despite the temperature. The leather pack, once filled with food and water for 2 days, now hangs useless on his back. A gust of wind passes over Jesse. He huddles into the cliffside, pressing his face against the ice. The lining of his hood brushes against his cheeks and forehead, but the soft fur has been replaced by ice, scratching his face with cold, sharp points. Just as the wind lets up for a second, he releases a hand from the rock which it had been gripping, and extends his arm higher, another handhold just within reach. Another gust pushes him just as the hand comes around the rock. The grip comes loose, the boots slip. Only the other hand's grasp keeps him from falling to his death, and he feels the skin there breaking, cracking like ice under a weight it can't support. Hurriedly, he jabs the toe of one of his boots into the cliff, the spike on the end of it digging into the ice, making him more stable. Pushing off that stability, he gets the empty hand to the same rock the other is holding, lessening its burden. It's been a few hours since there had been a ledge large enough for him to rest on, and it was taking its toll. Another jab into the ice, and now he is once again in control, as much as one can be on the side of a mountain. He takes in deep lungfuls of icy air. It scratches his throat terribly, yet he needs it. But more than air, he needs to think. Purpose. What I'm doing right now is for a purpose. One I never could have achieved if I were to have stayed in the village my whole life. I would have been missing something which I need. They might not understand, but this is the way it has to be. 5 days ago, Jesse stood in the large town hall near the center of the village. The old wooden building was crowded with anxious citizens, confused by what this meeting was about. Elder Quinton had announced the meeting would be held in the village 2 weeks ago, but not even he knew exactly why, only that Jesse had asked. Jesse stood beside the stage in the far corner of the meeting room, away from the entrance. He ran over the speech in his head that Harry had written for him, until the scene before him blurred into the background of his mind. Behind him was a hallway that led to the back entrance, near to him by no coincidence. He absently watched as people filed in, taking seats in wooden pews and murmuring as they saw a random boy of 19 preparing to speak. Jesse's heart was beating fast, and he shifted uneasily on his feet. His concentration broke, and nervous eyes began to study each new arrival, trying to find reassurance in each of their glares. They didn't. A hand came to rest upon his shoulder. When Jesse turned around, he was met with Elder Quinton, a bald, gray-bearded old man who seemed to be tired at all times of the day. He wore the standard elder's robe of light gray wool and a white sash tied at the waist, which somehow made him seem even more fragile than he was. With the meeting being held at dusk, he looked worse than usual, more exhausted, but it went beyond his posture. His face betrayed a fatigue that most could hide well, but Elder Quinton was likely too old to care or to be capable. He looked up at Jesse and spoke calmly. "I know you have a good reason for this," Elder Quinton said, Jesse already feeling reassured by hearing his voice. "But I do wish I knew it." Jesse took a shaky breath. "You'll find out soon enough, same as everyone else." The dismissive answer made the corners of Elder Quinton's mouth turn down. His eyebrows drooped and his shoulders slouched further. Jesse wondered briefly if the old man was feigning ignorance. It wouldn't be the first time. Shaking the line of thought out of his head, Jesse walked towards the stage, leaving Elder Quinton despondent behind him. He climbed the short stairs and turned to face the crowd, which had mostly settled in at this point. The looks he was greeted with were anything but welcoming. He ignored most of them, except two. His friend Harry, who sat near the front, a grim but encouraging expression on his face. Elise, Jesse's older sister, was a few rows behind Harry and far to the side. She seemed more surprised than anyone else to see her brother addressing the village, but a hint of curiosity or anxiety, Jesse couldn't tell, showed through how she held herself, leaning forward in her seat, eyebrows slightly raised. His mother was noticeably, if not unexpectedly, absent. Feeling a little lightheaded, Jesse took a final breath before speaking, momentarily wishing he were already climbing the mountain, a situation which, to him, was less nerve-wracking than the one he was in. Most of you are probably uncomfortable with the idea of me speaking before you tonight, but I hope you'll hear me out regardless." He paused, gauged the crowd. No expressions had changed, but an air of impatience hung over them, as if it were known that Jesse was simply opening for another to speak. He continued. "Many of the older members of the village," Jesse said, "will have remembered the last time someone stood where I am now and announced their goal of climbing the mountain. The rest, including me, have not been witness to such a speech, nor have I sought help in preparing one, so I'm not exactly sure how this goes." Murmurs spread through the mass of villagers. Harry nodded slightly, after a brief moment of looking confused, as if urging Jesse to continue, and panic had asserted itself in Elise's posture. Jesse felt as though he would faint, but he knew not even that would be enough to get him out of this. It was too obvious now what he would say, and he knew that people would hold him to it. As he continued, he did so increasingly louder, attempting to keep his voice heard over the growing conversation in the audience. "I know it is uncommon for one as young as me to say this, but that is not all you will find uncommon. Instead of the traditional timeline of the announced climb occurring in 1 year, I will be heading up the mountain on the morning of the day after tomorrow." Certain members of the audience began to speak up, addressing Jesse personally with questions or insults. Not the oldest, though, the ones who would have seen the last speech like this. They sat quietly in the back of the room, waiting for him to finish despite how skeptical they looked. The elders similarly stood along the side walls of the meeting hall, silent and stoic, save for Elder Quinton, who seemed on the verge of rushing up to Jesse, likely in an urge to both comfort and chastise him. "I hope my actions do not upset you too much, and I hope that with time you can come to understand why I chose this path." Elise was still, one of the few villagers who were. Her eyes remained on Jesse as his own landed on her. "I meant no harm." Jesse doubted if anyone even heard him over the clamor of the audience. His lightheadedness had become overwhelming, and his throat closed up enough that he doubted he could continue speaking if he wanted to. Seeing the increasing tension and energy of the crowd before him, Jesse turned and hurriedly walked off the stage, not even bothering to see what his sister or friend was doing. He moved down the hallway he had stood near previously, away from the meeting room. From there, he knew he could walk home without being accosted by the mob he assumed he'd just made. As Jesse walked down the hall, the sound of the crowd behind him grew dimmer, and once Jesse exited the building and walked into the warm, humid night, it was just a muffled noise in the background, soothing, almost. Some wooden posts with lanterns atop them gave some light to the moonless night, and the crickets and cicadas were a much louder presence now than the commotion behind him. He could feel the fog lift from his mind, a sense of clarity returning to him. "Jesse?" Elder Quinton said, after coming through the same door, breathing heavily from the short walk. "What was that?" Startled by his sudden appearance, Jesse's temporary calm dissolved. He sighed and faced the old man. "There's just what I said. Nothing else." He tried to sound confident, dismissive, but his voice shook in the face of the figure before him. He was unsure of whether he could truly lie to this man. Elder Quinton took a hesitant step forward. "But why? What could inspire such a decision in you?" A pause. "Is it to do with your father?" Jesse had anticipated this response. Even so, he wasn't prepared. Elder Quinton nervously moved on from Jesse's silence, unwilling to let the conversation stagnate. "Why the rush timeline? 2 days? 1 year is not some arbitrary number we came up with. It is what has been deemed the minimum necessary time to train in order to—" Jesse, in his frustration, managed to regain his voice, interrupting Elder Quinton. "I've been training myself for 5 years. I've known I would do this for longer. This is not some random impulse." "You trained alone?" Elder Quinton said, taking another step. "You can't have achieved the requisite skill with no tutelage." "Who would train me?" Jesse asked, louder than he'd intended. Elder Quinton took another step forward. "The instructors are for exactly that purpose." "No one else has ever done it," Jesse said, surprised to find himself yelling. "If they knew the secret to climbing the mountain, then why hadn't they done it themselves? And if they don't, then what could they teach me?" "Jesse," Elder Quinton said softly, "just tell me, why are you doing this? What do you have to gain? You cannot prove your courage by dying." Jesse shook his head, hoping to remove doubt from his mind. "Just tell me why." A wave of exhaustion washed over Jesse then, replacing the anger. Many moments passed as Jesse stood in the grass behind the town hall. Together, he and Elder Quinton listened as the commotion inside the hall died down, and slowly everyone left, returning to their homes. Jesse wished he could open his mouth, talk to his mentor, his teacher, his friend, to tell him that this was because of no failure on his part. Jesse walked away without another word. Now, his whole body aches, both hands holding the same rock, toe spikes driven into the ice. He begins to wonder how many others had gotten this far. His hands felt nearly about to break. Here, halfway up the mountain, Jesse felt for the first time that he might fail. He'd fail for the inability to find another way up, another path on which to continue. The feeling overcame him when the rock his hands clung to with whatever strength they had left began to shift. My father must have made it farther than this. I remember hearing about how damaged his body was when it fell back to the ground. Bones shattered beyond recognition, blood soaked into the ground, skin frozen in a harsh blue from the cold. I wonder what my body will look like when it's found. When he arrived back home after taking a walk around the whole of the village, time needed to clear his head. He found it dark and empty. If Elise was back, then she was already asleep, allowing Jesse to walk to his room in peace. Trying to find sleep on his thin straw mattress, he discovered the beating of his heart was determined to keep him awake. His eyes were reluctant to close, seeming to prefer the blandness of the stone ceiling and dirt floor. He felt a perfect mix of anxiety and dread, partly for the imminent climb, but mostly for the moment the next day when he would have to tell his bedridden mother he was following in his father's footsteps. The morning after his announcement, Jesse didn't want to go anywhere, especially with the hot, stagnant air he could feel drifting in his room from the window. Outside, he'd be hassled, harassed, and questioned. He wanted no part of that. But he got it anyway when not long after he awoke, Harry showed up at the door. Much shorter than him, and 20, nearly a year older than Jesse, Harry was the only person Jesse felt comfortable calling a friend. "Hey, Harry." "Jesse," Harry said, "you made quite a mess with my speech." "I made some last-minute revisions." Harry nodded his head. "That's where the mess came from." "And yours wouldn't have caused a riot?" Jesse asked. "Don't give yourself too much credit. No riots were started against you or on your behalf." A sound behind him caused Harry to look over his shoulder as a group of kids walked by carrying baskets of food and wooden planks. "Besides, you'd be surprised how quickly people bounce back after being upset." "So they were upset?" Jesse asked. Harry turned to face him and shrugged. "They weren't happy. No one's going to burn down your house or anything, though. Now come on, see the village one last time before you leave." Jesse glanced at the sky, and he could see the sun was still a few hours from peeking over the mountains. He had not seen his sister since the night before, and he still had to break the news to his mother sometime today. But that could wait. The mountains seemed different to Jesse on that day. They were no longer the walls they had been intended for, but a temptation, something there for Jesse to climb up, if not over. The range surrounded the village, creating a valley in which they were the only inhabitants, and yet, miles off in the distance, they seemed almost small. It was only when one stood at the base of them that they noticed the summit disappeared from view in a perpetual storm of ice and snow, and the infecting cold spread through one's body. The storm was supposedly there to ward off climbers. The drop in temperature served as a warning to stay in the center of the valley, in the village, to leave the rest of the world alone. Jesse followed his friend through the village. Walking the dirt roads, he noticed glances taken by everyone they passed, whether the eyes were timid and shy, looking away as quickly as they looked toward, or confident, making direct eye contact, perhaps trying to convey some type of emotion, though Jesse was never very intuitive about others in that way. They all had the same effect. Jesse began to question if telling the whole village was the right choice. Many of the adults looked anywhere from disgusted to mildly offended, but the younger ones were more often hateful or loathing. Every look was mixed with a bit of something else, though. Something Jesse didn't understand, but that he could tell was distinct from their annoyance. When they passed the old homes near the center of the village, with creaky wooden frames filled in with clay and dirt, and the spots of mold and permanent wetness in the walls, Jesse decided that maybe the entire village need not have known this early. But what was done was done. Nothing could change the eyes. "I knew the way I announced it was untraditional," Jesse said, leaning into Harry so no one else could hear. "But I figured they'd accept it since at least I'm climbing the mountain. I thought they'd be more grateful." "They can be grateful and angry. They aren't mutually exclusive," Harry said. Jesse doubted his friend's words, until they got to the center. A field of grass lay in the center of the village. It was usually empty, open to families and friends going on outings or picnics, but now there were rows and rows of long tables and benches, and the smell of meat cooking and bread baking filled the air. "They're throwing a feast," Jesse said. "That they are," Harry replied. "The elders had a meeting last night after your announcement. This is what they decided." Harry turned to study Jesse's face. "Didn't you want some of this? Even a little? If you didn't, you could have just climbed the mountain. No announcement necessary. You had to want the feasts, the statues, the celebrations. On some level, you did." "I announced it because I wasn't just going to disappear one day and leave people wondering why I never said anything." He took a breath, digesting the scene before him. "I thought 2 days would be too soon, that they wouldn't have enough time." "You underestimated people's love of tradition," In all likelihood, this will be the only climb people see for the next few decades. Even if it's not happening the way they'd like, they'll make damn sure they get what they can out of it. The thought came delayed to Jesse's mind that he'll be expected to attend the feast, to sit on the raised dais now being constructed and eat with the elders as was tradition. He was the newest champion of the village, after all. They would want him to make a speech where he professes his love for the village, how much he'll miss them all, how he hopes he'll finally be the one to escape, to save them. But would they really, or would his mockery of tradition thus far be enough to make them leave him alone? He wouldn't mind attending if he could simply sit and eat in peace while the celebration occurred around him. Not for him, but near him. Something he was intrinsically related to, but separate from. But out of all those people, someone would acknowledge him. Someone would think they had something he'd want to hear, or maybe something he should hear, and they'd break his delicately created illusion that he was not the center of attention. No, he wouldn't go. The only people he needed to talk to were Harry, Elise, and his mother, and he cared not whether he escaped or failed. I know what you're thinking, Jesse, but you have to attend the feast. No, I don't. They want me to, but why? They don't even want me to climb the mountain tomorrow, but they'll throw a feast for me today? I just don't understand why. Harry shrugged. It's just tradition. There's nothing else to say. He gestured to the table still being set up, the carpenters measuring the length of planks for the extra tables and chairs needed, Elder Quinton standing over it all on the dais. He saw Jesse observing from the perimeter. His face looked hopeful for only a second before Jesse looked away. I appreciate the help you've given me, Harry. I really do. I know I haven't repaid it, and I likely won't get the chance. Repay it now by telling me why you're climbing the mountain. Jesse met Elder Quinton's eyes again, and a brief moment of regret passed through him. I'm leaving. With that, Jesse turned around and left. On the mountain, the rock Jesse's holding on to shifts again, threatening to drop him. He wishes for a few seconds he had brought more gear, but he was determined to travel light and had forgotten the typical supplies other climbers used. Hurried eyes scan the mountain's surface for another rock, a handhold, a way to live a little longer. He sees one. To his left, 7 feet away, a large rusted nail placed there by a climber probably decades ago, maybe more. An example of gear he assumed he wouldn't need. Jesse pulls one of the boots out of the ice, placing it delicately against the wall, hoping the friction from the cleated sole will be able to hold him long enough to jump. He removes the other boot. The added stress makes the rock shift again. Jesse takes a deep breath. The rock of the mountain, the very same used to make the statues of the previous climbers. Every one needs to be remembered. Anyone could be the first to finally make it. Do I want to be remembered? Elise won't be remembered. Neither will Harry, nor my mother. Not even Elder Quinton will last in memory long past his death. But my father will. Despite not telling anyone, despite failing, despite the person he was, he'll be remembered for centuries to come. I've seen the statues of him. I've seen the statues of ancient climbers, at least the few that have lasted this long. How accurate will the statues of me be? Will anyone visit them in 10, 20, 100 years? I'll be simply another piece of stone among dozens. But it's better than being a skeleton among thousands, right? Do I even care? Arriving back at the house, Jesse saw a recently filled bucket of water from the stream on the table. Not wanting to delay the easier conversation any longer, Jesse picked up a stool and walked down the hallway to his sister's bedroom. He found her sitting in a wooden chair with her face turned down as she read a book next to the window. Jesse couldn't see the cover, but he knew what book it was. As children, everyone was required to learn of the village's past. I got home last night and you weren't back yet, Elise said, without looking up. Then you weren't here when I woke up. I thought I wouldn't see you before you left. Jesse walked in her room, set the stool down, and sat on it. You know I wouldn't do that to you. You're planning to leave and didn't think to tell me before you told the rest of the village. Jesse let the silence last for a moment. It's more than our father did for us. Elise finally looked up at him. That's who you're comparing yourself to? Really? She set the book down and sat back in the chair, putting her fist under her chin as she refused to meet her brother's eyes. Have you told Mother yet? I was kind of hoping you already did. Elise sighed and put her face in her hand. I haven't even checked on her to give her the medicine. I don't know what I'd say. That's okay. It's my responsibility anyways. Responsibility, she said with a small laugh. Elise then looked at Jesse for a while, her disappointed gaze, evident by her half-hidden frown, her sorrowful eyes, her guarded posture, making him shift uncomfortably in his seat. He wanted to leave, but couldn't find it in himself to stand up, to decrease the already limited time they still had together. Eventually, Elise turned away, shifting her attention to the book she had set down. She opened it and flipped back to the beginning through the old yellowed pages. She shifted the book in her hands, subsequently allowing Jessie to read the title, The Lives and Adventures Before the Mountain. She began reading. Beyond the mountain are villages unending, rivers as wide as houses, endless fields of dirt where endless food is grown. Beyond the mountain lies the world taken from us, the glory denied us, the privileges we lost. And here we stay in our prison outside of the world, where we spend our days in atonement. But one day, we'll make it back. We'll set our sights on new horizons once more. We'll make of our lives what we wish, without limits. She studied Jessie's face again. When she saw no reaction, she asked, "Is that why you want to climb the mountain? Do you want to save us? Free the village from our small corner of the world? Or do you just want to see what's beyond the mountain, what you'll find? Have a story of your own?" Jessie stayed silent. "Is that why?" When he looked at his sister again, he saw only her frown. He tried to face it, to look in her eyes, to own what he did. But he couldn't. He looked away. "I should have told you earlier," Jessie said. "I'm sorry. I know it's not fair to ask, but try to forgive me after I'm gone." He sat there for 5 minutes and never spoke nor moved his eyes. Then he left. Jesse jumps. He has a few peaceful moments in the air, not even noticing the hood of his coat being pushed off his head. The wind for the first time feels freeing, not restrictive nor oppressive. He is weightless as he is caught up in the falling snow and ice, and he thinks his eyes can pierce through the fog and snow beneath him to see people at the bottom, the people he left behind. Then an extended hand grasps the nail. Jesse's body continues down, jerking to a halt when his arm is stretched to its limit, nearly breaking the bone. After once more planting the toe spikes into the ice, Jesse uses a hand to pull back up the fallen hood, then stops to think. Here is proof that someone else made it this far. A long time ago, maybe, but it happened. And they failed. He knew this. Everyone who's ever climbed the mountain has failed, nearly all of them dying due to the cold or the fall. If any one of them had made it, the village would have been freed. Yet they're still there. Miles below, where Jesse now clings to the mountain, people go about their lives. The whole village will be freed if I make it to the top, according to legend at least. What a pain it would be to be a hero. We'd leave this valley and settle somewhere else. They would make stories of me, tell legends of my climb. We won't be the only village anymore. We'd need a name. Maybe they'd name the village after me. Maybe I'd be their leader. Maybe I'll die here, and mine will be just another body they find back at the bottom. Funny that, no matter how high someone climbs, they always fall on the same ground as the rest. It was nighttime when Jesse returned to the village once more after speaking with Elise. He'd spent the hours east of the village, visiting the spot on the mountain where he'd trained for so long. He saw the statues of previous climbers there, his father's the newest, but he often heard that it was inaccurate, though he was too young at the time to know if that was true. That was supposedly what happens when one climbs without an announcement. When he was about a mile out from the village, he could see the torches from the feast in the center of the village dancing in the night, lighting up the cloudy sky to a comforting orange hue. The smell of food once more filled the air, much stronger now, as was the smell of beer and wine. He could hear drums and other instruments being played, while supposedly people danced around the musicians and the fires and tables of food and drink. But it had all been silenced by the time he reached the edge of the village. The food smelled just as strong, but seemed colder and stale in the night air. The torches were less vibrant, less alive, even before they began being put out, the cloudy sky slowly returning to a dull gray. A pang of regret and guilt hit Jesse as he imagined the village packing up a feast they threw for someone who didn't even show. The celebration they had begun and subsequently ended not long ago, already ringing empty in their hearts. Jesse had taken away their reason to celebrate. He looked back at the mountains before he disappeared into the village. Tomorrow he'd go there once more to set out on his journey. Everyone would come to watch him. Everyone would be there for the day, waiting to see if he even made it beyond their sight. But his mother wouldn't be there. She'd be where she's been for the past decade of Jesse's life. She'd be in her bed. He knew it was time. Instead of going to bed, Resting for the taxing day he would have tomorrow, Jesse went to his mother. She was laying down on her small wooden bed with her feather mattress. Her head was turned away, staring at the wall opposite him. Somehow, he knew she wasn't asleep. He pulled up a chair and sat next to her bed. His mother didn't react. "Mother, there's something I need to tell you." He saw a slight twitch in her head, her hesitation. Slowly her head turned around, and she faced him. Her eyes were red, her cheeks were wet. "Do what you want, Jesse." She turned back to the wall. Of course she knew by now. Someone would have come to get him for the feast and found her the only one here. Or maybe she just heard the feast, smelled it, felt the music, as Jesse had when walking back. Maybe Elise had finally talked to her, and Jesse calmed his mind. He'd talked to everyone else he wanted to talk to, said everything he wanted to say. The only thing left was for his mother to know, to not have to question or wonder. "Mother," he said. Her head turned back around. "What?" "I want to tell you why." Pained and struggling, his mother sat up, meeting Jesse's eyes. When she settled, her short, thin hair graying at the temple, her face full of wrinkles usually reserved for someone significantly older, she spoke. "You think not knowing will be what keeps me up at night," she said. "You think I don't already know?" "It kept me up. When Father left, when he said nothing." His mother's face sagged, and she shook her head. "Jesse, why doesn't matter. I'll stay up with worry, with grief, not with questions. I'll hate the choice you made, but I won't hate the reason. I've felt it too." Her voice seemed to strengthen, and Jesse wilted under her now intense stare. "The desire to know. I don't want you to go, but I'm not wondering why." Jesse stared at her and saw she meant it, that she truly possessed the understanding that she spoke of. He nodded, stood up, and left. Jesse removes the toe spikes for the last time, his frostbitten hands pulling on the nail, surprisingly stable despite the decades. He gets high enough and jerks out a hand, grabbing hold of a rock more stable than the last. He thinks he can continue a while longer. The wind is unceasing now despite its inconsistency, but he can barely feel it anymore. His hands are clenched frozen, unable to make any other shape than what is necessary to prevent his fall. That's all he's doing, preventing his fall. It's been 3 days since he began, and he's barely slept. He's eaten only occasionally, and even then not much. The water is either gone or frozen at this point. Even if he has the skill to make it to the top, he'll die long before he gets there. He'll starve, he'll thirst, he'll freeze, he'll give up. It doesn't matter what happens. The result will be the same as it has been for everyone else in the village's history. Does it matter why I'm doing this? Does it matter what I hope to gain, what I think I'll find? If I succeed, the village will be saved. If I fail, those who knew me will grieve. These are truths not dependent on my motivation or goal, and they are the only things that should matter. But they don't. Not to me. I'll be grieved if I die in an hour or another 50 years. The villagers, my people, will live their lives whether it's in this valley or alongside the rest of the world. So these things, the existence of the village and the grief of those who know me, won't change regardless of whether I climb or not. So they shouldn't be factors that influence my decision to climb. The only thing that matters is what I hope to gain. But that only matters if I get it. The morning after the talk with his mother, Jesse stood at the base of the mountain, the cleated, fur-lined boots with toe spikes strapped to his feet, the fur coat worn tight around his torso, the pack filled with food and water for 2 days hanging heavy on his back. He went minimalist, a choice that he could see was not sitting well with Elder Quinton, Harry, and Elise. They stood before him. Elder Quinton seemed worse than usual, as though some part of his will to live had been left behind. There couldn't be much left of it to combat his age at this point. "Jesse, you need not do this. If you back out now, no one will think less of you. No one will call you a coward." "I know, but I don't do this to prove my courage," Jesse said. He took a step towards him and hugged the old man. "Thank you for what you've done for me. Elder Quinton returned the hug and breathed deeply, seeming to stand a little straighter after Jesse pulled away. Harry stood tall as he could at least, and his expression was once again grim, but encouraging. He met Jesse's eyes confidently and rushed forward for a hug of his own. Jesse was stunned for a second, caught terribly off guard by a gesture he never expected from his friend. He belatedly and awkwardly returned it. "I'll make sure they throw another feast in your honor once you're up there. I'll make sure they build a really accurate statue, too. I don't do this for praise or glory," Jesse said, "but just make sure it's taller than my father's. That's all the accuracy I need." Harry laughed softly as he pulled back. He pat Jesse on the shoulder before looking away and stepping back, seeming slightly embarrassed. Elise was slightly taller than him when they stood before each other like this. Her hair was reminiscent of their mother's, as it had been when she was younger, healthier. Neither of them initiated the hug, but rather they seemed to slide into it, as easily as falling back into a chair after a long day. For a while, neither of them spoke. "If you save us and come back," Elise finally said, "I'll make it a story, like the ones in the book." Jesse gave a half-hearted chuckle. Elise sighed, pulling back and holding his shoulders. "I'm not angry, okay? But I can't say I'm not sad or disappointed. You're not as bad as him, obviously, but you're leaving just the same. You're climbing the same mountain, and how far you go won't matter. It won't make what you're doing better." "I don't do this to save the village or to be remembered," Jesse said. He paused. "And I don't do this to prove I'm better than our father." With that, he made his way through the rest of the crowd of villagers who came to see him off, ignoring their stares, and approached the steeply inclined base of the mountain. He began to climb. Halfway up the mountain. Only halfway up. Everything he's done so far he'll have to do again. But the higher he gets, the more difficult it will become. The air will get colder, the wind will grow harsher, and the mountainside will become smoother. Jesse had always known why everyone fails, but he finally understands why no one has ever survived. Why everyone's body ends up back at the bottom, frozen in the cold and shattered like ice by the fall. He imagines Elder Quinton, Harry, and Elise finding his body one morning, and presses his face into the ice once more and cries. He cries because he still doesn't understand. "I think I'm farther. This has to be higher up than my father was able to get. For 3 days, I've climbed higher and higher, ever up the cliffside. So I must be higher than him by now. Did he find it? Did he find what he was looking for? Did whatever secret or mysterious longing that drove him to make the climb get satisfied? Was he content as he fell down the mountain, having achieved his goal? Did it matter to him he would leave a son who would grow up to barely remember him, a wife who would grow old in dire need of him, and a daughter who would grow up too soon because of him? Did they matter to him, those he left behind? Can I blame him if they didn't? They obviously didn't matter to me. This has been my first attempt at publishing a short story, as well as my first attempt at narrating a short story I published. I hope you enjoyed, and look forward to more short stories as well as chapters from books in the future.